If you intend to use hand tools in your woodworking, a rigid, heavy workbench is probably the most important tool in the shop. Without a stable place to work, trying to use hand tools is like an awkward dance. However, there are also some valuable appliances that make working with hand tools at the bench faster or easier than just using the bench vise alone. One of these is the bench hook. Now, we've already seen this version of the bench hook. It's just 3 pieces of wood that are glued and nailed together. One of these pieces creates a cleat that hooks against the bench, while the other piece creates a fence that allows you to butt your work up against when you saw a plane or chisel. While this style of bench hook is very easy to make, we're going to make a different style today that's made from a single piece of wood. To make this style of bench hook, you're going to need a piece of wood that's about 1.5 to 2 inches thick, 3 to 4 inches wide. Now, while I'll be using a piece of ash to make my bench hooks today, a piece of cutoff from a piece of 2x4 or 2x6 would suit just fine. In addition to the wood, you'll also need a combination square, a marking knife, a pencil, and a handsaw or 2. And if you've got a piece of wood that's long enough to make a pair of bench hooks, I definitely recommend you do so. Having a pair of bench hooks is even more useful than having just one. This piece is about 2 foot long, so I'm going to be making a pair of bench hooks today. So I'll start by cutting this piece in half. I'm actually going to cut it in a little less than half because there's some bad end grain down here that I want to remove. So I'm going to make 2 12-inch bench hooks. And for what it's worth, that's about the size of this one. So I've made 2 marks, and these are going to be 3rd class saw cuts. So being 3rd class cuts, I'll just use a pencil line, but I'm actually going to use one of my smaller joinery saws instead of a large crosscut saw, just to show you that for small cuts like this, you can still make these cuts with a small saw if you have to. Now, anytime you come to the end of a cut, when you're about ready to cut all the way through, you don't want to just let the waste piece fall off because you can splinter out or break off the corner. So it's always important to hold on to the wastes as you saw through. And that's going to give you the cleanest cut without breaking out the corner. Let's do this next one. So now that we have 2 pieces of wood to make 2 bench hooks, let's lay out for our next saw cuts. So these dimensions are not critical, but I'm going to use the spacing of the cleats that I already have, the size of the cleats that I already have on this bench hook. That way, I can use these in tandem. So these are about 1 3/4 inches in width. So I'm going to come down roughly 1 3/4 inches. They're actually a little bit more than 3/4, so I'll set that. And I'm going to set the fence on my combination square to a little over, nope, that's 1.5 inches, to a little over 1 3/4 inches, so it matches this. One way you can do that as well is to just put the square up against there, just like that, nice and loose. Align the end of the combination square there, and there you've got your setting. Now I want to take a look at these pieces of wood. I'm going to want to cut this part away. So this is going to be, there's a little chip there, so that's why I want to cut that part away. So I think I'm going to want to have a cleat on this side and a fence on this side. So I'm going to measure down. I'll use this to measure, just put a mark at 1 3/4 inches. Here, same thing. I've got a chunk taken out of this corner. So I'm going to come down and put my fence on this side at 1 3/4 inches. Now I'll open up my square, find my reference face, and I'm going to use a knife to define this. And this is going to be where my fence is going to get cut. So this is going to be a second class cut. So we're going to use the knife. Similarly here, okay, and I'm going to label these even with an F, so I know that that's my fence, not the back cleat. Now, we need to figure out how much to take away. Well, I want this to be roughly 3/4 inch thick when I'm done. This is about 3/4 inch thick, so that's what I want on here as well. This thickness is 1 3/4 inches. So in order to leave 3/4 inch, I need to take off 1 inch. So I'm going to set this for 1/2 inch, because I'm going to take 1/2 inch off of each face to make our cleats. Now an easy way to do this is to use your combination square as a marking gauge. And you can simply draw a line at 1/2 inch. Carry that up a little farther. And now, with our second class cut, we'll carry that knife line down to the pencil line. Now, a really great way to do this would be with a marking gauge. However, I'm trying to keep the tools for this particular bench hook at a minimum. So if you have a marking gauge, use it, and I'll show you how to use it marking out this one. But if you don't have a marking gauge, using the pencil and your square will get you a perfectly satisfactory result for this project. Now you're going to want a marking gauge later when we build our Hancock bench, but for now, for this you can just use a pencil and a square if you don't have a marking gauge yet. And we'll also carry that 1/2 inch across our end grain. I'm doing this at a kind of an awkward angle to try and get it on camera. Okay, so this on this side is going to be our waist. We're going to cut all of this away, leaving a fence. Now, if you have a marking gauge, there's an even easier way to mark all that out, and that's to set your marking gauge to 1/2 inch. So I'm just setting the knife to a 1/2 inch on the ruler, and I'll lock that in. Now I can use my marking gauge referencing off the face that I want to cut from. And I can scribe all the 3 sides of the cut that I need to my 1/2 inch. Okay, and I'll darken those lines up to make them a little easier to see. My pencil will just follow right in that gauge line. And again, we'll take our knife and we'll connect this line here down the side with our gauge line. And it's a good idea to get in the habit of marking your waist, even if it's blatantly obvious where your waist is. Later on, when you get into more complicated, complex things, it's not going to be so obvious. So always mark your waist. Now, marking the opposite side for the cleat is exactly the same, but we want to mark opposite. So here is our fence, so our cleat is going to be here. So I'll put a little C here, so I know that that's going to be the cleat. Now I can go back and do the same thing. And you can do this all at once. It would make things a lot faster if you did this instead of going, marking them separately. But for demonstration purposes, it's easier for me to do it this way. So again, fence is here, so cleat is going to be here. So now I'll just repeat the process. Scribe a line for the base of the cleat. You can carry it over. We'll do this one. Then we'll take our marking gauge and mark our 1/2 inch depth from this face. So that, because again, my board is 1 3/4 inches thick, is going to leave me with 3/4 of an inch. Now, if you're using a piece of 2x4, your marking gauge would be set to 3/8 of an inch thick in order to leave, 3/8 of an inch thick in order to leave 3/4 in the middle, because you're going to take 3/8 of an inch off of either side instead of a 1/2 of an inch. if you've done your layout properly, this is what you should have. On one side, fence. On the other side, opposite the fence, is the cleat. And your side layout should look like this. What we're going to end up with is this Z or S looking piece of wood after we cut it out. Now we practice some sawing. So my preference here is to start with the rib cuts. And in a normal piece of wood where I'm sawing through the thickness, I'll saw it all from one side. You notice here that I've got the wood at kind of an angle in the vise. When a piece gets above 2 or 3 inches thick, basically up to 2 inches, I'll saw from one side. When we get into wider pieces like this, so I'm sawing through the width here, not the thickness, which we call resawing, but that's not really important. What's important is the distance that we're sawing through. And this is about 3 inches, maybe a hair over 3 inches. When we start to saw through such a thick piece, it really becomes beneficial to saw from both sides. So saw a little bit, flip, saw a little bit, flip. So that's what we're going to do here, and that's what I suggest you do as well. So just as before, we're going to start with our saw without sawing technique. My thumb goes here, the saw goes against it so that I can start the cut and the saw won't jump or drift into the keep side. So I put my thumb on the keep side, the waist is to my right, saw without sawing to start the cut. And I can start to progress into the piece. Now, I've got a line across the top, I've got a line down the side. It can be difficult to try and track both lines. So what I'm going to try to do is get started down this side here, tracking that. And I'm not going to make a whole lot of progress across the top yet. So I'm watching this line, laying my saw down, and I'm going to follow as far as I can. Now I'm a little less than halfway here, so I'm going to stand the board up in the vise. And I'm going to start to progress across the end grain. Now I'm about halfway across the end grain. I'm going to take the board and turn it in my vise. And now I'm going to start from the other corner. So we saw without sawing. Slowly let the weight of the saw into the wood. Start to progress down this line here without making much progress across the end grain. Okay, so I'm a tiny bit less than halfway. What I've done is I've given my saw a place to track as I start to work across the end grain, because the saw is now going to follow the path of least resistance. So now I can stand the board up in my vise a little bit and start to saw across the end grain, and I want to connect with the other cut. Now I'll stand the board up vertically, now that I've made that connection, and the saw will follow the kerfs that I originally started. Now the whole time that I'm doing this, I'm trying to focus on keeping my posture correct. So, just like we discussed in the mechanics video, I'm lining everything up with the cut line, my eyes over the back of the saw. My grip is very loose. I can kind of just push this saw through with hardly any grip at all. Okay, I hardly have to grip the saw. I'm not bearing down at all on the saw. I'm letting the weight of the saw do the cutting. And occasionally, to keep myself on line, as I progress down the board, I'm going to flip it and start to come in from the other side again. When the saw reaches the bottom of my original kerf, I'm going to try and extend this a little bit. And again, the long line is your friend. By doing this and extending the kerf low like this, I can follow this line much better. Now that I've extended my kerf and I have a path of least resistance for the saw to follow, now I can stand it up again and continue. And as I approach the bottom of this cut, there's one more thing I want to point out. If you take note of my saw stroke, I'm using the full length of the saw as much as I can without ramming the handle of the saw into the wood. This is one of the reasons that I like a longer saw, because to me, they're more efficient in the cut. Short panel saws for cuts like this, you tend to teach you or get you used to short stroking the saw. So you start doing this, and you're only using maybe 10 inches in the middle of the saw instead of using all of the teeth. So try to focus on a nice, smooth, long stroke and use all the teeth. So I've reached my line here where I'm going to cut across. So now I'm going to start over on this side and rip down this part of the board. Now to make the cross cuts, I've put the piece in the vise, and it's the same process. Saw without sawing to start, I'm starting on this far corner, and I'm slowly nibbling my way back to the near corner, maintaining my good posture and my eye over the saw so I can keep it plumb, using my left eye to follow the line. Now, if you didn't get quite all the way through, you can come back and clean that up. And there we go. And clean up any little bits we may have in the corner there just by cutting in a little bit. You don't even need to plane or chisel or anything like that. Just use your saws and clean up that corner. There's one cross cut done. 3 more to go. So now we have 2 small bench hooks, again, that are very similar to this one, but made out of a single piece of wood. Just like our other bench hook, we can take this and butt some stock up against it. Makes a great place to saw. If you have short pieces, this one's a little long, but if you had a short piece that's thicker than your fence, you could put it on there and use it as a little planing stop to plane against. You can use it to chisel. So you see how valuable an appliance bench hooks can be. I use them on a daily basis in my shop. Every time I'm in here, anytime I need to do some kind of sawing of a small piece, I'm picking up a bench hook. The nice thing about having 2 of them like this is if you've only got one, such as this one, and you've got a long board to saw, let's say you're cutting a 10-in on a bed rail or a long table apron, this end of your board is unsupported. Now, with this little light piece of white pine, that's not such a big deal. But if you had a 4-inch wide piece, and maybe that was some kind of oak or cherry or maple, something much heavier, it's going to want to pull this down. However, with 2 hooks, you can put one under this end, one under this end. and you've got lots of support for the work that you're doing. Also, if you need to do some chiseling, you can use the two of them and leave a space between so that you can work your chisel through, or a router plane, such as this one. Maybe you're cutting a groove across here, like a dado. You can use your router plane across, and these help to hold things in place. So this is a really great little project to work on your sawing. So grab yourself a piece of wood, practice your sawing, because we're going to be moving on to a project later, and these are going to come in real handy when we go to build our bench.